Good morning. My name is Tessa, and I'm also a researcher. So the last few days we have seen how participatory video can be used in several ways. And today, what I would like to bring you, just like Martin did, is the perspective as a researcher. So how can you use participatory video as a research method, as a way of knowing and understanding human reality? And so I'm an historian and I work in post-conflict areas. And normal historians, they would try to figure out what happened in the past. I try to figure out how the past is present and how people deal with a violent past. Specifically, I work in Guatemala. They lived through a genocide and violence was so massive that it needs to be dealt with collectively. And so that is what I focus on the politics of history and how people use history in their contemporary struggles against ongoing injustice. And so as an historian, this is the story I will be telling you today, as an historian, I have been used. I have been recruited by a community of former refugees who are currently, they're Guatemalan refugees, and they are currently defending their territory against the construction of a hydroelectric dam. And so that threatens the community. And they used me as an historian to make their shared history, their shared community history, by producing a documentary about their past and present struggle. And so today I will give you my perspective on PV as an historian and as an activist at the same time. So it's the story of a researcher turned into a strategic ally, let's say. And I will demonstrate how PV can be at the same time a research methodology and a political tool at the service of community interests. And I will explain my approach on 3 different levels: filmmaking, participation, and knowledge. But before going into filmmaking, I want to give you a bit of context first. Guatemala was shattered by an internal armed conflict between 1960 and 1996, resulting in genocide against the indigenous Maya population. So 60% of Guatemala is indigenous Maya, or identifies as indigenous. Besides internally displaced populations, 400,000 people fled to neighboring countries, mainly to Mexico, so right across the border. And there, these people lived in UN refugee camps for more than 10 years, so not just a few years, 10 years. And the community I will be speaking about today is a community of former refugees. So people that fled to Mexico during the conflict, they fled from different areas in Guatemala, so they got to know each other in Mexico. And so there they lived in refugee camps. And so basically different ethnic groups got mixed up in these refugee camps. And in 1993, and those were the images you have just seen, in 1993, thousands of refugees decided to organize themselves and collectively return to Guatemala. And they did so with a political procession of 60 buses crossing the Guatemalan-Mexican border. So they refused to be individually repatriated by the government, and they returned collectively as a political act, let's say, to reclaim citizenship and reclaim their land rights also, because those are displaced people. And so one of these return communities is Copala, Copala La Esperanza, and La Esperanza means hope. Before going into exile, these people lived in different places, as I already said. And so they got to know each other in Mexico, returned collectively, and founded a new multi-ethnic community on land negotiated from the government. And even though these people consist of different ethnic groups, they all self-identify as returnees. But their common future is now at risk, as I already said. They are now threatened by the construction of a hydroelectric dam on the nearby Chicxoy River. And I think you will see, voilà, here is the river. And this dam will be constructed on the river and actually displace more than 60 regional communities. And since the foundation of their community, they come from different places, different groups. They try to build a collective project. So they have become a bit obsessed by history. or very concerned at least. So who are we, where do we come from, and where are we going as a group, a community, or as returnees? And the possible construction of this dam now actually reopened a discursive space in which historical narratives are being renegotiated and collective identities are being renegotiated as well. And with my research, I could tap into this ongoing community process, which unexpectedly turned into a participatory filmmaking project. In 2015, that was the first time I went to Coppola. In 2015, local authorities had invited me to their community when they heard that I was roaming around the region and looking for victim-survivor communities to participate in my research. I had absolutely no idea why they were so enthusiastic of having an historian. To be honest, all the other victim-survivor communities I worked with were super cynical about academic researchers because nothing good comes from academic research. Or they were afraid to talk about the past. We are in a post-conflict context, so talking about a very present and recent past is difficult for many people. But in this community, history was everywhere. But I didn't know why they wanted to have me as an historian, let's say. Weeks on beforehand, people were prepared for the arrival of the historian in the community. And when I arrived, we had a first community council with all the people from the community, and local authorities, they took the microphone and they wanted to clarify the reason of my presence in front of the community, but especially in front of me. So they wanted to clarify what my job was to be in that community. So they clarified that they had already started this work a while ago and that I would come and help to make the history of their community. And this is literally in Spanish, hacer historia, to make history. And right after this speech, the community started negotiating with me about research methods, about possible research outcomes, and how this academic thing I was doing could also be of use to them, because they were sick of researchers coming in the community, taking away knowledge, writing academic books that no one reads, and them to be put in academic libraries. So they were used to this, and they said, no, we're going to do it differently this time. And so they negotiated, and they insisted that if I wanted to do any oral history interviews, I had to record them, all of them, and turn it into a documentary about their past and present struggle. So it was basically a precondition to do research with this community. And so this suggestion to start recording actually made a lot of sense. It did not come out of the blue. I quickly noticed that the returnees were permanently occupied recording their everyday resistance. Smartphones were everywhere to record roadblocks, protest marches. They even had like video clips of self-made protest songs that are all over YouTube. So even though these people are literally in the middle of the jungle, defending a territory that nobody is able to see, we can all see it because they use their smartphones to make it internationally visible and to attract international solidarity in defense of their territory. So it was logical to engage in filmmaking, not only for them, but also for me, because as I have said, I was frustrated also as an academic. I had worked with other communities, and I had always felt very guilty about my own role as a researcher. So when they asked me to film, it made a lot of sense to me. First of all, I saw this as an opportunity to get access to the community. And second of all, as an opportunity to be able to finally give back something to the people I work with. So in terms of reciprocity, let's say. However, from side project, a filmmaking side project, this and a matter of research ethics, so giving back, filmmaking would unexpectedly turn into a research methodology, a way of doing research and understanding human reality. But to understand how this can become a research method, I first want to explain what I mean by participation, of what the meaning of participation became during the filmmaking project. Because I did not know what participatory video was back then. I did not have a PV Code handbook, so I had no steps to follow, you know. And I wasn't a filmmaker. So I had no clue on how to proceed, but that was not a problem because they knew very well how they wanted to proceed. And so to understand the emergence of specific participatory practices during this project, we have to get into community governance practices. And those are the result of 3 different historical, political, and cultural trajectories. So first of all, community organization is partly rooted in indigenous consensus governance, in which decisions are made through constant and repetitive deliberation and interaction between rotating authorities and councils. Second of all, the returnees spent 10 years in Mexican refugee camps. So they have come across international NGOs. They have appropriated human rights discourses, and they started to experiment with participatory democracy. So that's the second point. And thirdly, and this is maybe the most complicated one to quickly explain, but I want to try it nevertheless because it's important. Among the founders of this return community are ex-combatants. So people who at some point participated in the Guatemalan guerrilla. And guerrilla bases, they were organized according to the Marxist-Leninist principle of democratic centralism, which actually tries to combine two seemingly opposed forms of governance, so democracy and centralism, top-down, bottom-up. And it is often explained as freedom of discussion, but unity of action. And so it is a decision-making practice combining participation with strong leadership. Why? Because you are in a situation of war, and these guerrilla bases need to be able to act fast and quickly if possible, so participatory processes cannot drag on forever. So it's a pragmatic way of dealing with participation. And so community governance today in Copala is based by a fusion of these three things, but no longer in a context of armed conflict, but translated into contemporary community resistance. So I want you to keep these historical and political trajectories in mind when I will now explain what participation meant or became to mean during the filmmaking project. Once I agreed to participate in making this documentary, the community immediately took charge of the project. They started coordinating and arranging everything. And a very interesting dynamic appeared between participation and coordination. And not only participation from people in a filmmaking project, but my participation in the making of their history. My coordination as a researcher, but also the coordination of local authorities. And so local authorities became the co-directors, and they selected 21 community members to be documentary participants. Some of these people had already volunteered during the first community council. Others were pointed out and selected. Participants were selected according to different age categories and their assumed knowledge about specific experiences or themes that local authorities thought should be in this community history. But all these should be ideas, they emerged through consensus and deliberation in this community council and were then taken up by the coordinators at local authorities to continue with. And so the rest of the community, besides these 21 participants, was supposed to be consulted through the community council and in a later phase also through screenings of preliminary video materials. And I was considered as la historiadora. I was the historian, and I had to facilitate this process by following very clear instructions that were given to me. I had to visit participants and ask them the questions that were given to me. And of course, I'm now telling this black and white. Of course, we discussed, we prepared these interviews, but I want you to have a clear notion of that, the idea that I was instructed, okay? I was recruited. That's the main point here. And I was not only expected to facilitate, they also wanted me to do the final montage and editing of this film and basically put my name on the film. So this was not a film by the community. This was a film by an international Belgian historian. That's the point, but I'll get there. So unlike many participatory video projects, I did not give the camera to the community. The community gave the camera to me. And what is very interesting here is that in the way they proceeded, the co-directors actually started to divide narrative labor according to different community participants. And to me as well. And so put together, they were capable of telling a broad historical journey of eternal displacement, injustice, but also of repeated struggle and resistance. But they needed different intergenerational groups to tell this story. They needed to combine different experiences that individual participants not necessarily all could relate from personal experience. And so I was very positively surprised also and interested in the first presentation talking about collective emplotment. And you saw these pictures of, I don't know how to say it in English, but like this structure. You try to weave different things and try to create a whole. And that was exactly what we were trying to do here. Create shared history, not do an individual sum of testimonies and put them next to each other. No, we were trying to find a collective voice in this exercise. And that brings me to my last point, knowledge. So from side project and a matter of research ethics or giving back, PV turned into a way of doing research. And it gave me access to a very specific kind of knowledge that I would not have been able to access otherwise as a researcher. It gave me knowledge about how groups of people make history together, about the process, really, of making history, the collective production and mobilization of historical narratives, the politics of history, really. Knowledge about social struggle also, which are often processes that have collective subjects. So a kind of shared collective knowledge was also accessed through PV. And secondly, participating in the filmmaking project myself, I also became very conscious about my own role in the co-creation of the narrative that I was supposed to be studying. So you see the academic struggles coming up here. Was I objective? Have I gone too far? We can discuss that. So that is how I gradually changed my approach and decided to do an ethnography of the filmmaking process itself. In order to study the making of history. And I consider this a shift from informal to performative ethnography. And Maarten already quickly referred to this idea of performance. So Johannes Fabian, he's an anthropologist, he says that informative ethnography is the kind where the ethnographer asks questions and hopes to obtain knowledge or information from his participants. According to Fabian, however, there is a very specific kind of knowledge that cannot be found out by asking. And he says this sort of knowledge can be represented or made present only through action, enactment, and or performance. So the ethnographer's role is no longer that of a questioner. He or she is but a provider of occasions, a catalyst in the weakest sense, and a producer in the strongest. The point is that Fabian thinks that a performative ethnography is a kind where the ethnographer does not call the tune, as Maarten said, but plays along. It is not what you observe. No, you both get engaged in it. So keep this idea of performance in mind. We started filming, and after several interviews, it struck me how great this story actually was, how vividly recounted by all its participants. It was the story of a people that was displaced over and over again, went into exile, returned, founded a new community, and bam, a dam. I mean, it sounded like a Hollywood script, a David and Goliath story, very similar. And I also heard echoes of Bible stories. The Exodus was heavily mobilized in this, trying to tell this story together. So the story of exile and return appealed a lot to my imagination, and it made me instantly sympathize with the returnees. And that is why I say in the beginning, I was used, I was seduced also. And so they made me super enthusiastic, and they got me into their project. They mobilized academic funding. So this project is paid, and we haven't been talking much about resources at the festival. But so they managed to not only mobilize my academic legitimacy, visibility, but also my resources. So what I'm trying to say is that by making this movie, I became very aware of their collective narrative capacity. Some groups are better at telling stories together than others. And I went on trying to find out what are the factors that determine this collective narrative capacity. But I'm not going into that, that's too academic. But so the returnees did not only seduce me with a great story, collectively told, it was also surprisingly coherent. Nobody seemed to contradict each other. I looked for counter voices. They were not there. And so they were capable of collectively telling and retelling this story. And what made the story even better was that during interviews, participants would bring diaries, photographs, historical videos of this return to back up what they were saying. And the same photos appeared with different participants. So they used the same visual framework to put their individual experiences in and create something collective thanks to this collective imagery that they had, this archive really. And I discovered that they had this because life in exile was documented by international NGOs. These people have a history of being documented and accompanied, as they say it, by international people, and I fitted into the exact same historical trajectory. So all these insights I got thanks to making this film. So it became clear to me, what I'm trying to say is, it became clear to me that this was not the first time that these people were doing this collectively storytelling exercise. I realized that the filmmaking project or process was just another phase in the telling and retelling of this collective history that had been going on for a while already. And this actually connects very well to this idea of performance I gave you back then, because Fabian says that performance is a way of giving form to human reality through continuous repetition and rehearsal. And this resonates with theater also, of course, that is idea of performance, but repetition and rehearsal. If you want to make narratives, these are not static things. You make them, they're constantly in the making, they're dynamic, you tell them, you retell them. And that's what I also figured out, that they had been telling and retelling this for a while now. And this became even more clear when suddenly, at some point, authorities shared with me storytelling tapes that they had made themselves 2 years before my arrival. And you will... So I wasn't even in the picture here yet. So they know how to manage cameras, and I just want to give you a quick impression.
Vamos a empezar, es como contar la historia. Lo vamos a usar para ya hacer el historial de Copala.
Porque la metodología va a ser en que de repente don Hugo está hablando. Eso fue lo que pasó la vez pasada, ¿verdad? Él está hablando y en eso Clemente se acuerda de una cosa. Sí, es cierto, pero mire que también pasó esto, ¿verdad? Entonces, mucho movimiento de la cámara desde aquí para acá.
Ahí donde relata un poco, pues, cómo fue la conquista.
La revolución del 44 a 1960, ya de ahí algún otro pueda comentar. Y otro sobre el retorno, por lo menos don Diego se enteró bastante sobre el retorno, cómo se organizó en México.
¿Quiere don Diego empezar?
Pues bueno, como soy el más viejo de todos, yo les quiero contar qué pasó en el 80, pero que también entró el ejército guatemalteco y aparte de eso sobrevolaban aviones del ejército de Guatemala.
Yo también quiero comentar un poquito también de cómo nos trataron los mexicanos.
So what do we learn from these tapes? They were given to me during the process, but they were made 2 years before. So they confirm this idea of repetition and rehearsal, that they were already engaged in making this narrative before I arrived. Basically, they had been trying to create this collective story the moment the community was founded, because every community has some foundational story to create a group to become returnees, basically. And it also confirmed that I, as an historian, had been used. So that was, again, obvious from that. Now, after my first fieldwork period in 2015, so I started this project in 2015, and we are still ongoing. So we have been going through a long path together. So after my first fieldwork period in 2015, I tried to do the job I was recruited for and grasp this collective voice or shared history. I will not get into all the details how I did so, but during several meetings, the community council, individual interviews, a storyboard had emerged orally. Nothing has been written on paper here. We did not do exercises with post-its or whatever it is. We just we talked a lot, and I was given very clear instructions also on paper. They had already tried to, they had different versions of the history from different years. They had educational materials in which they teach their own next generation what their parents had been going through to found this community, and so to actually make very clear the urgency of why it needed to be defended, because they had been going through this whole historical trajectory of displacement. But it was also possible, because of this whole trajectory of resistance, that should motivate people to actually engage in action. So we already discussed the link between storytelling and action. Ian is also the one trying to get into the action part, right? So. But anyway, so I tried to grasp this collective history based on instructions that were given to me, and I made a rough montage of 6 chronological chapters. I'm not getting into the content of them. I just want to give you an impression of my approach. So the rough cuts were my first interpretation of this community's shared history. I made them, and in 2016 I returned to Kopala and organized community screenings with these rough cuts. And then my interpretation of their history was taken up by the community, collectively discussed, and then readapted. So this connects again with the process of repetition and rehearsal, which apparently is not only a way to understand how history is being made, it is also a way to understand how researchers proceed to understand, because every time we did this collective feedback exercise, my understanding of their collective narrative capacity grew. And I want to give you a short fragment of these rough cuts. I just picked a few fragments from what is actually 1 hour and 15 minutes of montage.
Yo, ¿para qué voy a esconder? Es una historia, es un cuento, yo le voy a decir, ya sufrí.
Todo lo que ha pasado, uno lo tiene grabado en su mente. Yo digo, es igual que un disco. El disco se puede joder, se puede borrar, pero uno lo que tiene ya grabado en su memoria, eso no se le va a quitar.
Pues la raíz del conflicto armado interno fue la injusticia, la tenencia de la tierra, la injusticia, la explotación, la desigualdad, la opresión.
Empezaron las persecuciones directamente del ejército y llegaron a buscar, estaba perseguido mi hermano mayor, que estaba acusado como formar parte de la guerrilla. Yo no sabía nada de eso, era pequeño todavía, no pensaba, y llegaron a buscarlo en la casa.
Cuando la guerra se empezó, pues empezaron así a matar todo lo que son dirigentes de la comunidad.
Mejor levantemos, así se fue la guerra, pues empezaron a organizar todos los campesinos.
Pero el ejército, o sea, que descubrió que toda la gente, o sea, que estaba organizado, y por eso hubo masacre.
Entonces de playa llegaron todos los ejércitos con helicóptero, y quién va a llegar a hablar con ellos, todos tenían armas así.
Pues llegamos de México, ahí como que yo sentí que sí, ya salvamos, pero hay una cosa ahí, ya dejamos nuestro país.
El gobierno quería que se diera un retorno, pero que no hiciéramos bulla, que no se diera cuenta las comunidades que están acá en Guatemala, pero ni mucho menos la comunidad internacional, ¿verdad?
Pero nosotros dijimos no hay que tener miedo, tenemos que romper la frontera.
Entonces vivimos 10 años sin ningún tipo de amenaza, sin ningún tipo de conflicto, sin ningún tipo de riesgo, hasta que en el año 2007, para ser específicamente, el 2007, se retoma nuevamente el tema del proyecto hidroeléctrico Sala. El gobierno no es el dueño de las tierras. El dueño de las tierras somos nosotros, los pueblos indígenas.
La lucha sigue de nosotros los pueblos, la lucha no termina y nosotros pues seguimos luchando. No es porque ya somos mayores un poco de edad, no vamos a luchar, sino seguimos luchando. seguimos pidiendo al gobierno, seguimos pidiendo a los ricos que no nos hagan daño y que no hagan daño a nuestra naturaleza. Y andamos clamando por nuestra libertad, por la paz, la justicia, todos, y por ahí vamos nosotros.
So after 2 fieldwork periods, 2015, 2016, I ended up with a rough montage of 1 hour and 15 minutes. But we had a problem. We looked at it together, and I mean, you applaud now, but if you were to see this for 1 hour and 50 minutes, you would fall asleep and ask to leave the room. It was boring. We had to conclude that this was not a good movie. We managed to grasp the collective narrative, but the impact of this movie, or the desired impact, was just not going to be there. So that were actually the limits of my participatory approach that appeared there. First of all, the film had also an overload of characters because we were trying to be so participatory that eventually it became very confusing. And so also due to my limited filmmaking skills, it was slightly boring to watch. And this is not just what I decided. We decided that together, that it was boring. So to be very quick and to end this presentation, we decided to involve a professional filmmaker. And here again comes the question of resources. Because I am an academic, I have access to university funding. I managed to find these resources. Took me a year, so timing is also crucial. I think it would have been possible that this dam would have already been there by the time that I have found these resources. Luckily, that is not the case. But so I found this filmmaker, I paid him with my resources, and his job was to translate the rough cuts into a Hollywood movie with impact for an international Western audience, so that you would become very concerned with their struggle, and I don't know what you would do, raise money or whatever it is, but it's also a matter of raising awareness with international policymakers and politics, and to visibilize actually this local jungle struggle that otherwise no one else would be seeing. And plus, the people that are trying to construct this dam are international companies that are very sensitive to their international image. So if someone says, well, human rights violations might occur here, they might pull back. And this has already happened in other cases, so it's not a romantic story I'm telling you here about the actual effect or impact of video on social struggle. So I'm just gonna show you the trailer of the movie we are doing now. We are in the editing phase, so it's almost done. The release will be in January, February. Guatemala has a new government now that is actually reimposing again extra mining and hydroelectric projects. So this dam is not there yet, but it's still ongoing. It's in process. It's an open ending, this story. So I'll just show you the trailer and the story of the negotiation between an historian, a filmmaker, and a community. Different story to tell. I won't get into that here.
Somos refugiados, sobrevivientes del conflicto armado y retornados a la vez porque estamos de nuevo en nuestras tierras, ¿verdad? Estos son huesos que encontraron ya de la gente masacrada anteriormente. Aquí están escarbando nuevamente, encontraron otra fosa donde hay huesos que los que vimos allá.
Ay, sí. Triste recordar. Pero hay una chica me dijo, no, se puede sacar, me dijo, se puede olvidar. Me dijo, vete en el río, vas a agarrar el agua, lo vas a subir en la cabeza, vas a lavar tu cara y así se va a ir borrando. Es difícil que se me quite, le dije, y nunca me va a quitar eso en mi cabeza.
Las más de 900 víctimas murieron en distintos lugares de esta región. Murieron los hermanos que dieron su vida por la tierra. Nuestras tierras, nuestras comunidades están siendo amenazadas otra vez. Nos hicieron una guerra con armas. Ahora nos hacen una guerra desalojándonos, privatizando nuestros ríos, privatizando otra vez las tierras.
Estamos aquí en estas tierras que nos dieron como reemplazo de las tierras que se nos había quitado y estamos tratando de conservarla para la nueva generación que viene. La lucha sigue, de una de otra manera sigue la lucha.
Thank you. We'll stop here.